Well, thank you for coming this evening. A great turnout for Ross and his panel. My name is Russell Hittinger. I'm the executive director of the Institute for Human Ecology. I want to also thank my staff, especially Stephen Higgins, who put this together. Now, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce to you this evening a man whose pen has become one of the most incisive and thought-provoking in American public discourse, Ross Douthat. As a convert to Catholicism and a columnist for the New York Times, Ross embodies a unique intersection of faith, politics, and cultural commentary. Stop. That is the beginning of an introduction created by AI. Namely, Claude Sonnet 3.5 version. I tried two others, and what struck me is that they didn't say anything incorrect, and 100% laudatory. So, what are we going to do with that? Thankfully, the AIs that I used didn't address me as follows. Si follower sum, I err, therefore I am. So, to return to a real introduction, Ross is one of our longest standing partnerships here at IHE. And of course, he is an opinion columnist for the New York Times and a media fellow with IHE. We have very much enjoyed friendship and collaboration with him for many years. We're very honored to sponsor these conversations. We're grateful that Ross travels here from his home in Connecticut to lead these discussions. And as a reminder, Ross and the panelists will begin by having a conversation, after which there will be some time for questions from the audience, and there will be someone with a microphone. You raise your hand, and we invite all of you to join us for a reception after the panel. Without further ado, I will turn things over to Ross, and he will introduce the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you so, it's a little too, there we go. Thank you so much, and thanks to all of you for being here for a little pre-election counter-programming, a panel discussion that's not about the likely results of the 2024 election, although maybe it's a panel discussion about the actual issues from 2024 that will be remembered long after a litany of things that I refuse to even mention that are occupying my social media feed right now are forgotten. We are going to talk tonight about remaining human, or the threats to humanity in the digital age. And it's going to, the idea is that it's going to be sort of a two-part conversation, with the two parts hopefully sort of naturally bridging into one another. We're going to discuss, I think, two big questions that hang over human life in digital reality right now. The first one might be distilled as, is social media dehumanizing us, making us miserable, destroying our relationships, warping our intellectual lives, robbing us of creativity, that kind of thing? And then the second question is artificial intelligence replacing us? So dehumanization and replacement, I guess, could be the two touchstones of this conversation. I hardly ever use Claude, ChatGPT, any of these things. I do occasionally request, just to check up on my own obsolescence, a column in the style of Ross Douthat. And usually I read it and I think, actually that's more like a column in the style of, well, I shouldn't even say who it is. So I won't, but it's not quite mine. So I haven't been, every 6 months or so, I like to confirm that I'm not quite obsolete. And here to join me in non-obsolescence, I think, is a terrific panel representing a diversity of interesting views and takes on these kind of questions. And going from left to right, we have first Luke Burgis, who's a professor of business here at Catholic University. He is the author of Wanting, a fascinating book about some of the moral, philosophical, and psychological issues related to mimesis, desire, and related matters that all have, I think, profound implications for the way we live online right now. He's also the director of the Clooney Project, which is a just launched initiative, sort of trying to work at the intersection of faith, reason, and innovation. Athens, Jerusalem, and Silicon Valley. That's his line, not mine. But in that sense, I think, well, I'm hoping that he will bring a certain degree of grounded optimism to a conversation that, at least in this kind of space, far from Silicon Valley itself, might tend too much towards pessimism otherwise. And then immediately to his right is John Askonas. There we go. Who is an assistant professor of politics here at Catholic University. I would say a brilliant voice when it comes to analyzing the kind of sort of fragmentation of discussion, attention, and conversation that characterizes life in the digital age. And he's also the author of a really fascinating series entitled Reality, a Post-Mortem, that appears in the journal edited by our third panelist, Ari Schulman, making his second appearance in several years at one of these panels. Thanks for coming back. And he is the editor of The New Atlantis, which is, I would dare to say, the Western world's finest intellectual journal when it comes to writing on the cultural and philosophical implications of scientific and technological change. So if you're not a subscriber to The New Atlantis, you should be. He paid me $500 to issue that plug. So we're going to start. So yeah, as I said, we're going to start with sort of social media and that world, that discussion, and then try and segue organically to AI, and then segue even more organically to your questions and have a fun conversation. So I want to start with the argument that I sort of gestured at earlier, which is probably most prominently associated now with Jonathan Haidt, sort of academic eminence of techno-pessimism, you might say, he and others have done a lot of work over the last few years arguing that basically somewhere between the development of the iPhone and the full emergence of social media, human nature's relationship to technology was altered in a profound way for the worse, and that many of our present discontents, from sort of the despair of teenage girls to the derangement of our politics, but generally a sort of mood of unhappiness, difficulty forming relationships, difficulty sort of operating in reality, can all be traced to the malign effects of having a machine in your pocket that connects you to social networks that are designed to addict you, substitute for friendships, substitute for relationships, and keep you from having the life that you would otherwise be meant to have. And so I want to start by just asking each of our panelists for their reaction to that idea, since it's been debated back and forth, mostly on the internet, often on social media itself over the last 4 to 6 years, I would say. So Luke, starting with you, what's your view of the view that social media is dehumanizing us, to go back to my first phrase?
My initial reaction to John Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, which got a lot of press, was why is this book so popular? I mean, doesn't everybody already know that our phones are kind of making us miserable? And my friend Ben Hunt has this interesting phrase he calls the common knowledge game. So that a common knowledge is what everybody knows that everybody already knows. And there's a movement sometimes from private knowledge to public knowledge that's really important for the public that I don't think I fully grasped. So privately, I see that the emperor has no clothes, but it takes the little girl to point and say something for everybody else to see that. He wrote an article on this right after the Biden debates, right? We all kind of knew, but we weren't sure until it was before us. So I think that's why the book mattered, right? So I guess to support John's work, it sort of moved us from private knowledge that I think many of us wrestled with to some form of public knowledge, and it's why it's so important. Now, I love my technology. I have a beautiful brand new iPhone in my pocket. I recently just hired a wonderful new teammate who's sitting in the back of the room that I met on Twitter, and I would never have found him if it weren't for social media. So you'd have to pry this phone from my cold, dead hands to take it away from me. It's been wonderful in my life. At the same time, it has caused tremendous tension for me. And I think I kind of sit in the middle, and I think telling you just very briefly kind of a little bit of my story will help to understand. We don't understand technologies and the effect of technologies until long after usually we've adopted them. Marshall McLuhan tells a story of a village in India that got running hot and cold water, and it disrupted the social associations of that village so much that everybody said, get this water out of here, we don't want it anymore. They were no longer having conversations around the well anymore. The social structure was chaos. And when that's happening, the initial reaction is kind of the techlash, get this thing away from me. In hindsight, running hot and cold water is probably a very good thing.
Jury's out.
To have.
No, yeah, sorry.
Yeah. So I think there's some of that going on right now. I look at myself, I'm one of the oldest millennials. I was born in 1981, the first year that MTV launched, highly influential in my life, right, the TV medium. But I didn't really understand until decades later how influential it really was. I went to school in New York City, and really the only reason that I did was that I saw really good rap music videos that featured New York City, and I decided I needed to get out of Michigan and go to New York City. I didn't realize that as it was happening in the moment, but it was pure mimetic desire, which a phone generates. So this phone is not powerful as a device. If this phone only contained some really interesting games on it that weren't connected to other people, it wouldn't be very interesting to me. What makes it interesting to me is the other people that are on the phone. So I think and I think what John Haidt sort of misses a little bit is sort of the powerful associations that it creates to other people, where we begin to seek our sense of self through the phone. So the reason that the phone is so powerful to me is that it's actually become the vehicle through which we seek community. It's become, in the words of Robert Nisbet, the vehicle through which we seek community, or we're on the quest for community, is through our phones. And it extends us throughout the world, puts us in dialogue with other people through which we're constantly having our self or our sense of self mediated back to us. So every technology always, I'm drawing on a lot of McLuhan here, but enhances some sense to the diminishment of another. And the sense that I think our phones are enhancing is not one of the five senses that we normally talk about. It's actually our social sense. So we have some kind of heightened social awareness to the detriment of other senses. For instance, this is what happened to me with my heightened social sense. I practically cut my finger off a couple of weeks ago. So it's accelerated this kind of social sensory awareness that we have, but probably so fast that we have no idea what's happening. And young people are missing critical rites of passage that they used to have as a kid that actually help them develop a solid sense of self that I don't think a purely phone-based exploration of identity can do. When I was in 5th, 6th grade, 7th, 8th grade, if I had a crush on a girl and I wanted to talk to her, I had to go through the excruciating rite of passage of picking up the phone and dialing her landline and having her dad answer the phone and say, "Yes, Mr. Nicholson, yes, who are you calling for?" And sort of, I'm calling for your daughter. What is this regarding? I had to go through this humiliating kind of rite of passage that now, you can just text your crush or post something on social media. So I think that we need new rites of passage for the digital age. I don't know what they are, but I think we have to develop them and develop them pretty quickly. The kinds of things that will actually help young people mature. And I'll just end with this. I always think about the line from Bilbo Baggins where he says, Gandalf, I'm old, Gandalf. I feel stretched so thin, almost like butter that's been scraped over a piece of bread. I think I need a change. I need something. And he goes on this adventure. And social media seems to be making us feel so stretched thin at some existential level, at the level of our identity. And when Bilbo is really talking about embarking on an adventure, rite of passage. So what's that going to be for my daughter, my 10 and a half month old daughter who's in the room? I don't know, but it keeps me awake at night. I think about it all the time.
John, do you want to just react to either my question or Lou? I'll ask some more pointed questions in a minute. But.
Sure. Well, I'll take the opposite side of that bet, as it were. I mean, I do think that, like you said, the valuable thing about the anxious generation is it sort of says the obvious, that giving smartphones to 14-year-olds is a terrible idea for a large number of reasons. And I think, in 20, 30 years, it'll be looked back on as an insane and barbaric thing we did, like when Coca-Cola actually had cocaine in it, That being said, I do think that this conversation is missing something, which is almost all of the trends that Haidt and others want to sort of scapegoat social media, big tech companies for, they all predate the smartphone. They're amplified by the smartphone, but they all, almost every to a one, predate the smartphone. And if you zoom in on the particular harms that are supposedly created by smartphones, things like loneliness, lack of friends, unrealistic beauty standards, kind of particularly in high school, like very cliquish or alienating social behavior. These are all older critiques of American life, common in the 80s and 90s. And I think what's happened is, what I think we'll find, like your McLuhan's Indian Village, is that the effect of smartphones, the effect of social technology, is an amplification of existing social structures, maybe to the extreme. And what I think it's actually done is sort of revealed features of American life, features of our media landscape that, again, predated the smartphone. And I think, and again, this is not at all taking a position on particularly smartphones for kids or teenagers. I'm very opposed to that. I do think in retrospect, once we've sort of overcome this initial shock, narcissistic shock, McLuhan would call it, of the smartphone, once we've built some institutions and culture and norms around how we engage with this technology, that its pro-social dimension will come to be seen as more important. And I think one evidence of this is Haidt's next book, I believe, and his Substack is called After Babel. And the thesis seems to be, once we had this world of sort of shared reality, shared consensus, and now it's just been destroyed by smartphones, by social media, et cetera. But of course, for those of us, people of the book, we know that in the story of Babel, Babel is the dystopia, the city in the tower in which all of mankind is gathered into one space. I think McLuhan and others, actually we were talking earlier, Michael Crichton in The Lost World of all places talks about the destruction of humanity that would occur if humanity were actually gathered into a single communicative space, where a single space of shared mimesis, a single space of shared ideas. And one of the things I think that we are benefiting from in the social media age is actually fracture, is actually the reemergence of smaller spaces and groups where actually new ideas and concepts and culture can form?
I will join the pessimists. I appreciate your adding the diversity with a little bit of optimism at the end there. The thing that is interesting to me, I think, like to Luke, is why do we need this book to tell us what seems to be so obvious? Part of the answer is that it isn't obvious to everyone, or if it's obvious, there's the things we all know, and then there's the public language that we have, right? So sometimes you have to have social science research to just cash out things that everyone kinds of knows, to launder it into a language that's legitimate and public, and that state of affairs is what it is. But to me, the ultimate question that we're confronting here with social media and smartphones, I was thinking back about the advent of this switch, which I'm old enough to remember. I don't think I got a smartphone until after college. I was the last of my friends and family to do so. But I distinctly remember this switch and wanting to resist it and seeing it show up. And there was a sense of irritation, first of all, that came along the first time that you were in social gatherings and people started pulling out their phones. But there was also, to me, there was a sense of loss that was fascinating to me and that it took me some time to make sense of. And I wound up doing some writing about this at the time, particularly about GPS technology. I think the best metaphor that I've heard for it comes from a writer named Lawrence Scott. He wrote a book called The Four-Dimensional Human. And it argues, we're in this room, we can move around in 3 dimensions. He argues that there's essentially a 4th dimension of movement that's been opened up by this device that everybody is transporting around. You're able to connect to these far off times and places to people who are essentially anywhere. And the way that I encountered that personally when smartphones first started showing up was this sense of artifice and loss in a kind of present situation. You're there, you're caught up with someone, there's a moment that's happening, or maybe there's a sense of frustration or dullness, but whatever it is, it's contained to that spot. There's a kind of a clear context and a border and a wall. And the smartphone opens it up, and it does so in sometimes unannounced ways. You can be there, and then you can discover that there is this portal sitting there, that the person that you're there present with is actually off somewhere else. And part of the reason I was thinking about this was that I resisted this for many years, and now I'm as much an addict as anyone else. I criticize these technologies, but I'm checking my phone. I think my phone now tracks how many times I pick it up a day, and I'm afraid to look at what the statistics is. It's probably terrifying. But you think about all of these, try to put yourself back in this mindset of about 15 years and just as a thought experiment, work through some of the kinds of strange social effects and cultural effects that you might expect that to have. And what do you know? These are all the kinds of effects that we've been talking about happening for the last 15 years. We can't definitively prove them. Just for example, so John and I co-wrote this piece about the speech moderation question on social media, right? Should we be free speech maximalists and have a kind of marketplace of ideas and a sort of Socratic University of Chicago classroom style where all ideas are open, or should we be going more on the misinformation side and cracking down on hate speech? Well, people have been having this argument for 10 or 15 years as if there's an answer to it. And the argument that we presented was maybe there's just no answer to it, right? Maybe that kind of a question is only answerable in a room where you have, say, 100 people or 20 people, like in a classroom, where you can kind of all agree on what you're doing there. Well, when you're on a forum with potentially 1 billion other people, are you ever going to have that kind of agreement about what you're there for? So maybe that question isn't answerable in that context. And I think there's an analogous set of problems that we've been encountering in so many other areas of life, right? So that sense of presence in a place, right? You're there in the family dining room and talking to people, or you're at a bar and talking to people, or you're in a classroom and talking to people. All of those walls have been broken down by the opening up of that 4th dimension. And there are all of these problems that follow from that, right? So we see all of these statistics that kids aren't dating, and young people aren't dating anymore, people aren't getting married anymore. All of the kinds of adolescent rituals, some of them once kind of scorned and derided, these things are dropping off. And people are kind of evacuating into these little shells. And I think what you're seeing is that dimension that was initially greeted as a new space of freedom, it's more like it was the dimension under us, right? It's like, what if the floor opened up and just dropped out from under us? Well, that would be a new dimension as well, but it would totally unmoor us. It would rob us of all of the context from which we can make sense of these kinds of contexts of social meaning. I think that's the fundamental problem that we're facing here. And then there's a secondary problem that we don't really have a public language where we can really articulate and talk about that. So we have to wait for these 10 or 15 year long research things that find a 47% effect of whatever. I know we have to have that language. It's good that these books are now being written, but we should give ourselves the permission to just draw on our own experience and our own intuitions about human nature to say this is obviously bad and we're caught up in a collective action problem and we have to find some way out of it.
Yeah, well, let's talk about the collective action problem, because I feel like the place where optimistic and pessimistic accounts sort of meet is in the idea that at some point we're going to figure out a way to master this technology, right? And the pessimists are going to say, it's going to take a lot more effort than you would like to think, and we need this is a severe problem that needs sort of dramatic steps in response. And the optimists will say, well, maybe it will happen more organically as we get used to the technology. But either way, there's an assumption, right, that we'll get new rites of passage. If dating apps turn out to be not the best way to pair off the sexes, right? Then people will retreat from them, right? And there will, we will sort of develop new half digital, half enfleshed modes of socialization that benefit from the good things that, as Luke was saying, the smartphone delivers, but sort of stop short of being perpetually captured by it, right? And I want to believe that, but I struggle to articulate myself how exactly that's going to happen beyond the sort of basic, like, okay, we shouldn't have smartphones in middle school, right? Okay, it's like, all right, we can exercise better control at the level of childhood and early adolescence. I think we can agree on that, and I think you're already seeing schools making halting efforts in these directions. My daughter's middle school, everyone has a phone, but they're not allowed to take their phones out of their lockers during the school day. Okay, that's sort of a bare minimum of control and restraint, but it seems to work reasonably well. But beyond that, like, what are, for any of you, optimist or pessimist, what are the things that are happening now in response to this technology that make you optimistic? John, I'll start with you. When you talk about sort of subcultures, right, sort of flourishing in this fragmented landscape, what are examples of subcultures that are flourishing in a way that isn't just sort of, people hanging out and playing pretend on the internet, right? Like, what are make this concrete.
There's a beautiful subculture called 4chan, right?
Right. Well, right. No, let's make optimism concrete for a minute.
We moved on to much more esoteric forums. I think I can think of examples. In communities that I'm sort of involved in. I think the New Atlantis recently published a piece on mystics, which I think is a terrible name for a very interesting idea, which is, for a long time, maybe not so much anymore, people sort of derided the Amish as Luddites, which is also, by the way, is a slander on the followers of Ned Ludd, but that's another discussion. But of course, the Amish don't reject technology. What they do is they carefully consider the effects that any new technology is going to have on their way of life, and they place social rules and norms around the use of those new technologies to minimize the impact on their Gelassenheit, on their serenity. And I think there are subcultures today that are beginning to do the same. So yes, your daughter's middle school might have the sort of minimum rule of stay in your locker, but there are
It's not the minimum. I can assure you, by the standards of schools around the country, it's not the minimum rule. Well, that's fair. It's not the minimum. But soon
it will be, I think. But there are communities that are collectively making this decision of we're not going to give our children smartphones at all, cell phones at all, and organizing around that. I think of. I think. So the question is, how can you expose yourself minimally to the kind of what Ted Gioia has called kind of dopamine culture of just swiping the next thing on TikTok, and can you maximize the pro-social benefits of finding fellow-minded people, reading interesting things together, thinking and talking together, meeting up in real life together. So, for example, the Free Press today just had an article about a meeting, the second annual meeting. It was Micah Meadowcroft and I went to the first one last year at the Wagon Box in Story, Wyoming. which is 6 hours north of Denver in the absolute middle of nowhere. And a group of sort of self-proclaimed doomer optimists, ranging from DC intellectual types to literal anarchists to preppers to people who, in the U.S. military, met up, community that began online, convened online, very emerged online, met up in person to have an in-person gathering and talk about these issues that are important to them, build real social ties and connections. That kind of thing is going to become much more important and much more common. And I think it's already begun. That's the optimist in me.
Do you want to offer, Luke, the optimist?
It's already seems to be happening. So I don't know if anybody's heard about the NYC running clubs where single people in New York City have sort of rejected dating apps. The stock prices of the dating apps are plummeting, and single people in New York City just get together to run together in the morning, and that's how they're choosing to meet. So there has been some kind of rejection. So I believe that there do need to be decisions made on the policy level. Families are critical. Communities need to decide their telos and then make decisions about how they use technology that align with that teleology that particular community has. John used the example of the Amish. And I think that's really important, and establishing cultural norms around it. I don't know if we can do that on the national level. I'm a little skeptical. I do think there can and should be a vibe shift to accommodate the policy stuff. I think that's very needed. Like, it'd be great. I'd love it if it was taboo, for people to take out their phone in St. Peter's, while the Pope's walking down the aisle or while I'm talking to them. I would love for that just to be culturally taboo. I don't know how that happens. Here's what I really worry about, though. I don't think that knowing what's happening is enough if we're being affected at the level of the will and we're being affected as agents. So I'm a little skeptical of the ban smartphones in the schools, keep smartphones out of the hands of anybody 16 years of age or under. That seems to me to be a bit of a reductionistic solution, possibly scapegoating in some way. And I wonder, temperance is a higher virtue than abstinence. And I wonder if, maybe we don't need a ban, we need a gymnasium. Right? We need to bring back, some form of training, actually, and actually media training. McLuhan was talking about this back in the 60s. But what does that actually look like today? If we could expose children to different ways of being, these embodied, rich, fulfilling interactions with other human beings and how that feels, and then the phone-based interactions, so they begin to just become hyper-aware of that at a young age and go through a kind of formation, quite frankly. I don't know. I really don't have the answers, but I think about that all the time. Like, is the ban just overly simplistic?
Let me pick up on the phrase doomer optimism, which is a great phrase, because that I sort of indulge in that myself a little bit nowadays from time to time. I'm sort of obsessed with the idea that these technologies, along with a host of other social forces, are creating a kind of unprecedented bottleneck, a kind of evolutionary bottleneck for individual human families, entire nations, human cultures, where basically the groups and populations and cultures that basically let themselves be sort of carried under by these technologies just aren't going to make it, right? For, one of the last events we did here was about fertility and family formation, right? So I'm glad someone besides me brought it up, right? But one of the ways in which the smartphone era seems different from past technological eras is because it's not throwing people out of work and, we'll talk about that maybe in a minute with AI, but it's not creating this sort of massive economic dislocation. It's creating this massive social dislocation in which, again, entire nations are ceasing to be capable of replacing themselves, seemingly, right? And so that's sort of the doomer side of things. And then the optimism side of things says, well, if there is this bottleneck, then sort of perforce by necessity, the groups and peoples and cultures and families that make it through will have figured out these questions, right? You just won't make it through the next 75 years as a family or a society if you can't figure out how to get your kids to relate to one another in reality. Because if you can't figure that out, they won't get married and have kids, and poof, you're gone, right? But the doomer side of that still seems pretty big, right? Like I feel like that's when I spin this out to people. I haven't written the bottleneck essay yet, and I'm like, but this is good news, and they're like, is it good news? And it's not, like if South Korea disappears, that's not actually good news, right? Like if large numbers of human beings are just sort of lost throughout their 20s and 30s in this kind of digital space, don't form normal attachments, families, and so on, and just sort of age out of reproductive life, like that's bad. So I guess I'm looking for optimism that's one step more optimistic than that, right? That says like we can get more of our society through the bottleneck than it seems like we're going to get at this point, right? And this extends to other things like sort of practices that I think, the newspaper industry that I work in was sort of a harbinger of this, right? It was one of the first sort of old school enterprises to go through a bottleneck. The newspaper industry has gone through a bottleneck, and kind of only the New York Times has come out the other side, plus, some other enterprises like the New Atlantis, but that's been sort of remarkable to watch, but it hasn't been a good thing, right? And you can see this happening with the fine arts in America. The fine arts are having, everything from, ballet to opera to all these things. They're having a really tough time in the digital age. Anyway, I'm sort of rambling, but that before we pivot to AI, I'm just, is there a way to sort of be more proactive in figuring out how you get the largest possible parts of our society through this bottleneck? Or are we just doomed, and I'll go to you, Ari, as the doomer, right? Are we just doomed to go through this, and a lot of things that we take for granted aren't going to make it through?
I hate to say I'm kind of on the doom side. I mean,
that's why I went to you.
Right. I mean, I was kind of hoping you weren't going to ask me to offer optimism. I've been racking my brain. Say something. Good. They've been good on optimism. So the reason for optimism is that which can't continue doesn't. But the reason for pessimism is that it can continue for a really long time before it doesn't. And yeah, I'm sort of the view that you are, that if I think 25, 50, 100 years from now, are we all still going to be on Twitter and using dating apps and doing all these things? It's very obvious that we're not. I don't know what's going to replace it or how, and I don't know that what replaces it isn't going to wind up being worse, which is going to be the pivot to the next subject in a second here. But yeah, the question is, what about the people who are alive now? I go back and forth between two thoughts. One is that the only possible response to a question of such size and scale is individual response and cultural response and thinking within your own personal network along the lines of what John was describing. But then on the other hand, that feels to me like an abandonment of all of the people who aren't, reading premier intellectual magazines and high culture and high status, the kinds of people who are up in their heads and doing this kind of stuff. It feels like necessarily a niche enterprise. I guess the question is whether it's still possible to contest national culture, for there to be a national culture. I wish that I had an answer to that. I think it is still worth contesting and still worth talking about publicly. And one of the things that I try to do with my magazine, to plug it a little bit, is to try to take questions that are typically niche and the kinds of ideas that people preach to acquire, and to try to bring them to the broadest possible audience and bring them out of just niche intellectual spaces and really try to contest them publicly, just to see the extent to which it is possible. And it does seem to me, if nothing else, I know a lot of people who are not deeply immersed in intellectual culture and probably haven't heard of Jonathan Haidt, who have arrived at these ideas on their own and are trying to make these kinds of changes in their life, and that they may not know how, and they're kind of experimenting, But it seems to me to be a broader phenomenon already of people trying these things than just the intellectual culture.
So you got to optimism.
Okay.
That's optimism.
I found my way around.
There you go. Yeah. Any thoughts, guys? And then we'll do some AI.
The counterpart to we're not going to make it, of course, is we're all going to make it. Wagmate for my Gen Z in the audience. Look, I mean, I think it's almost definitionally the moment we're having the most intensely pessimistic conversation about a new technology is the moment after which the kind of seeds of renewal have already
the night is darkest just before the dawn. Yes.
Yeah, you could say this. Yes. If you go, look, we're still only a few years after the kind of shocking experience of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the important and interesting thing that will be remembered about it, of course, is not a virus; it's the kind of radical and instantaneous shift to a fully digitally mediated existence. And I think in many ways we are still, that was the beginning of this of a shift, and we're still working that out. But reliable sources, tell me that if you go to certain parts of New York City today, that all of the most kind of interesting people, the richest guys, the hottest girls, are not on the apps. They are meeting up in CD clubs just like they used to. Like they're having interesting discussions.
Who tells you this? And where are these clubs?
There's a barista named Stefan, right?
That's right. No.
Fidelio.
That's right. The point is the kind of seeds of cultural renewal are already there. And I think it'll be, as always the case, it will be a long time before it trickles down to your average person. You're not in your head, not in one's head, intellectual types. But I think we'll get there as a culture because we have no choice, frankly.
Right, or it could end up with a kind of bonfire of the normies, if you will, right? Where you have like sort of these high social capital subcultures that become anti-smartphone, that meet up in the dingy bars in New York City, that sort of reconstitute the pre-smartphone era, and then along with the doomer pet optimist, you mentioned the Amish, right? So then you have Amish and Mennonites and so on also inheriting the earth, right? So it's sort of the elites and the weird religious subcultures, but middle class suburbia seems like that's where the trouble.
Mimesis always, the mimesis means that there will be this attraction from elite culture down into and through popular culture. If you go to Columbus, Ohio, you will find the kinds of cupcake shops that were popularized in DC or New York a decade ago, right? There's this sort of the natural, trickle-down cultural economics. I don't know. What do you think, Luke?
I don't know if I kind of buy that Hayekian, culture has changed with ideas spreading through the elites. I mean, Christianity itself did not grow and spread that way, right? If you think about it, so it's like I'm way more a doomer than I'm appearing on this panel, but I was pegged to be the optimistic guy, so I'm playing my role.
You've got a project that you're building.
So I think that we need intermediating institutions, and I think we're going to see a springtime of those springing up. So it can't just be me, the individual, and the state, and then the only thing in between is the 25 group chats that I'm a part of online. That's just like a real recipe for disaster. The family is where we sort of learn and understand who we are. And the families are breaking down. People aren't having families. And then, we go from this kind of dysfunctional family situation, if we have one at all, to what? To this digital world that John was describing. That's a very scary place for me. The group chats are a very scary place. And so this quest for community is simultaneously the quest for differentiation. And what seems to be happening with this loss of community and where people are seeking their identities online, it is all differentiation all the time. Just people responding to other people, and it's like it's turtles all the way down. And I'm like trying to understand what's real there. So I think, and my hope is that we're going to see people getting sick of that, getting exhausted by that. I'm betting on pure exhaustion of these fractured online communities where you can just float. You know, you can leave one anytime you want, right? There's not a lot of friction or costs associated with leaving. I don't know if that's really a good thing. You know, the best communities, there is a cost to leave and there's a cost to join. This goes back to the rites of passage discussion. But I do think we're going to see people trying to form these intermediary institutions like we used to have, so we can fill the gap between, you know, let's say the state and the individual.
All right, so as I anticipated, the first part of our conversation was rich enough to eat up most of our time. And, you know, the AI god demons are not necessarily going to get their due. But all of this discussion is happening in the shadow of a related but different ongoing technological revolution, which is the emergence of artificial intelligence, which already plays a certain kind of semi-submerged role in the social media landscape, or, you know, the general internet landscape, where the kind of relations, the mimetic relations, the group chat relations, maybe not the group chat relations, hopefully most of them are screened, but people are in these relationships online, not just with other human beings, but with sort of digital creations already, and that's going to continue. So just for a minute, I want to talk about where we think the AI revolution is going, how far, and its effect on human beings. And I'm going to start with Ari, because I think you have especially interesting things to say as someone who's actually in your prior life done work in this area. And we'll go down the line, go back and forth, and then we'll open it up to audience questions. So.
Yeah, so I don't know that I have a prediction about where it's going. I don't know that anyone does in a believable way. The interesting question to me is just, will it be radical or will it not be? Right now the vogue is to say that it won't be, and I think that's a pure take cycle artifact. There was an initial vogue to say it's going to be radical, and then the savvy thing is to say that it's not, and that's where we are right now. I think that's basically meaningless and baseless, and the nature of this shift of this technology, I have partially been impressed by it because I spent the first maybe 5 years of my career as a writer and journalist basically arguing that everything that was being called artificial intelligence at the time was essentially a scam. It was all useful technology, but it had nothing to do with simulating intelligence. It was basically the same technology you have in your Excel linear regression model. A lot of sophisticated critics of artificial intelligence over the years, some of whom actually created early artificial intelligence programs like Joseph Weizenbaum, became critics of AI because they realized how easily people were fooled by this. And they noticed things like early AI programs could beat college students and beat mathematicians at proving mathematical theorems, but they couldn't do things like stacking blocks in a room, tasks that 4-year-olds could do. Or they couldn't understand the placement of a word in a sentence. So in English, if you switch a word's placement in a sentence, it can completely alter the structure of a sentence. And people can intuitively grasp that linguistic meaning. AIs have not been able to do that until about 2 or 3 years ago. So there's this long list of tasks that had long been, I think, rightly predicted that AIs were not going to solve them, or at least nothing that was being called AI for the last 60 years was going to solve them. And all of those things have been knocked down. These long lists of all of the standardized testing scores, and AI is scoring in like the 95th percentile on that. I'm amazed that people have gotten themselves to the point where they're kind of ho-hum about that achievement. It's a staggering achievement. The nature of the technological breakthrough it's like 5 orders of magnitude bigger than social media, which was not an interesting technology at all. It was very, very simple in terms of the code. It was just, nobody had kind of thought to do it before. There was nothing really technologically sophisticated about it. I don't think anyone really knows what we're in for, so consider me on the radical side.
Yeah, I think I'm there's a sort of 2x2 of will we get super intelligence or not? Is it radical or not? And I think that the two over-indexed positions are we'll get super intelligence and that will be radical, or we won't get super intelligence and it won't be radical. And I'm very much in the we won't get super intelligence and it will still be radical.
That's what I think. I don't think we're getting super intelligence, but it's going to be radical anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think to underline this, we are still so very close to the beginning of we have AI models that pass, the Turing test, I've joked before, is not a test of computers, it's a test of humans, which is to say, like, how well can you tell that you're dealing with a computer agent? But the models we're building are becoming sophisticated enough that we have models that pass the Turing test, not because they're so sophisticated, but because humans aren't that sophisticated. There's a great classic joke, in someone asked someone at a national park why the trash cans were designed the way that they were, and the ranger replied, well, it turns out there's a substantial overlap between the smartest bears and the dumbest humans. And I sort of feel that way about AI. There's a whole slew of tasks, some of them, kind of very mundane business tasks, some of them not at all mundane. One thinks of running surveillance systems, where even the small marginal cost of having a human review it has greatly limited the way you could construct those systems. And that cost is now gone. And I think that's going to have very radical implications. We're basically going to rebuild every business, every institution around the kinds of potential that this technology has, even at its current level. And we're going to do that for evolutionary reasons, because if we don't do that, those companies or those governments will be beat by ones that do. And so I do think we're in for a rough ride. I don't think it's necessarily I'm not worried about labor. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that, especially in a world of falling demographics, in some ways AI is kind of just-in-time innovation in terms of productivity advances that it might unlock. But in terms of the scale of institutional change, especially in business and government, I think we're not ready for it.
I have an optimistic case that I can offer. I don't want to cut in on Luke, but if we have time.
I'll leave you time because I want to hear it. One of my favorite books is a book by Pierre Bayard called How to Talk About Books You've Never Read. It's a fascinating book of philosophy. It's funny, but there's a lot of truth in it. And sometimes I wonder if that's what we're doing with AI. It's how to talk about something that we haven't really, most of us haven't used a whole lot of. And is AI or books, in the case of How to Talk About Books You've Never Read, are they actually just some proxy for something else in the culture? Is it just a way for us to talk about something else? So what are we really talking about when we talk about AI? Are we actually talking about agency? Or what is it about AI that makes it something that absolutely everybody needs to have an opinion on? Every conference is about AI. I'm trying to sort of ask the kind of the meta question, if you will, about what it is we're actually talking about. Because I don't know. I do think it's going to take us at least 5 years to really wrap our heads around what's going on. I can say I use it on a daily basis, and I'm currently writing a book, and I dialogue with the AI about ideas that I'm thinking about. I do not recommend it. It's scary. It's really scary, to the point where I find myself in the way that I'm thinking and the things that I'm thinking about writing. I enter into such a reflexive process. I'll ask a question like, has anybody else written about this before, or does anybody else have this opinion, to try to make sure that I'm saying something that's not already out there. That's a really dangerous game to play. It just becomes this very reflexive process. So I did that for the very beginning of the book, and I was like, I got to turn this off. This cannot be part of my routine. Until I had an 8-hour conversation with it on my drive from Michigan to DC last week, which was interesting in itself. So, I am somebody that is just trying to grapple with it in my own creative life. I do think there's something to be said about doubling down on our human sort of creative and artistic spirit, which the AI, I believe, the AI can never replicate. So sort of getting back to the kind of, spiritual theology of creation, I think is something that we'll probably hear a lot more about in the next few years. At least I hope we do. But yeah, that's where I'm at.
You wanted to offer some optimism.
I'll offer the optimism. It's doomer optimism.
Well, that's the best kind.
It's essentially, I think you could take some of the trends that we've been talking about here with social media and smartphones and make a case that AI will greatly magnify and accelerate those trends to the point that the kind of crisis point that we've been talking about that might happen in 50 or 100 years instead happens in 5 or 10 or 15 years. And we just get through that pain point more quickly. So like the social media speech moderation example that I used. Or here's another example I like, criminal justice. There are algorithms that are used in the criminal justice system to advise on the likelihood that somebody is going to reoffend, and therefore they play a role in deciding whether somebody's going to jail or whether they get pretrial diversion. This is an example that you can find hundreds of examples of this once you start looking for it, where we've misidentified what's ultimately an interpersonal problem as a rule problem. And we're saying we need the rules to be as fair as possible. And the way that you get the rules as fair as possible is you take people out of the system because people are biased and flawed. Well, maybe part of what's happening in the justice system is not just that there are rules that are being followed fairly, but that there's a person who is doing this to you, and that this person is part of your community. They bear moral weight. There's a burden that is placed on this judge, and sentencing someone to jail, they have to carry that around. That is a sort of slow brewing crisis of the impossibility of locating the forces that are acting on us and where agency exists and who it is that is oppressing us or sentencing us to jail or censoring us, or who it is that we're considering marrying if we're working through a dating app, right? That dislocation, all of the applications that people are most excited about with AI seem to be an acceleration of that trend. And we see these glimmers of this already in how much people hate AI art and Midjourney, and how there's already this kind of instinctive sense of dehumanization and flattening, and everybody kind of knows like this is going to hasten the decline of Hollywood. So maybe all of those crises that we've been waiting for we're going to get through them faster, and something else is going to be on the other side.
If I could hop in, one last note of maybe doomer optimism. I mean, I think to answer your question, Luke, about what is so fascinating about AI, it's very simple. It's the thing that's most fascinating about any new technology, which is what does it mean to be human? How does this reshape what it means to be human? And I think in this case, for the last 400 years of Western culture, we've placed reason, and a particularly narrow view of reason, on a pedestal, to the point where there are some self-identified rationalists who basically identify being a human being with being able to reason in a certain way. And then now we have a machine that is able to replicate or imitate this kind of intelligence, this kind of reason. And to the extent that you've bought into that logic, it calls into question what it means to be a human being. So I'm very optimistic, because I think what it demands of us is that we refocus on the other parts that are left out of that, of what it means to be human. And I think the challenge of AI, to return to something you said earlier, Ross, is what does it say about you if you're the kind of writer who an AI can imitate? What does it say about you if you're the kind of, I tell this to my students, if you're the kind of, if your ideas are, if ChatGPT can spit out the things that you're going to say, what does it say about you as a thinker, as a student, as an expert? And so I think what it demands of us is a higher standard of creativity, of specialization, of learning, of thought. And I think it overthrows the sort of industrial model of education that we've pursued in this country for at least the last 100 years. Because, ironically, if you learn to read and write the way that sort of the kind of critical reading, critical thinking school of education would have you do, you sound like an AI, right? So this is why I think we are already going to experience a huge flourishing of classical education. It is much harder for an AI to imitate. So I'm calling me an optimist.
Okay, I think I have more things to ask, but I think that's a good point to bring in the audience. So we have 2 microphones. Only one of them is held by a member of the clergy, but don't let that deter you. And we'll just take questions from, starting with the gentleman in the middle. Yeah.
Hello, Ryan Schinkel, Thwart Magazine. My question, I remember Jared Lanier, right, had the remark that it's foolish to sort of look at an AI versus a human, same way as a man running versus a car going fast, right? But there's something that can be used with that metaphor, which is that, when people invented cars, they weren't necessarily expecting, speed racing and NASCAR and the kind of heroes that we have in our national mythology based on people who mastered the engine like that, were able to take it in new and innovative and sleek ways. Is there something that could be the same with AI? I've interrogated AI probably about 200 hours about its ethical guidelines, and it's trying to get some of its coding when OpenAI first came out a couple years ago. And I found that it was an extremely efficient imitation machine. It's something that could take prior intellectual property and rehash it and reuse it. But if I imagine at a certain point it could create a new Bruckner symphony. but it's not necessarily going to create a new Bruckner. There's not a Bruckner bot that'll be unlike any other prior composer, and then it'll do something new in art in that way. But I imagine that a future Bruckner, could master AI to be able to compose something in some inconceivable way. I'm just curious, is it possible that the mastery of AI could lead to new rejuvenations of many different spheres of art and human life that help us be better versions of ourselves and create better and innovate more?
It's a really interesting question. I do think one of the weirdest things about AI is its ability to summarize and draw across a massive corpus of content. And then the question is, what AI, when we're talking about AI, up here we've mostly talked about LLMs. What LLMs really are next token prediction machines. So we're going to get very interesting artists probing the limits of what you can do with next token prediction. So for example, there have already been people playing around with some of the open source models and using them to identify really deep, what appear to be very deep linguistic connections by deleting or basically telling the LLM to delete or to move away from certain tokens, and kind of exploring what computer science called the latent space of the model. So I think we're going to see art that's made that way. We're going to see art that builds. I think this is going to do really interesting things for like world building. We haven't yet seen a Bruckner or a Beethoven or a Tolkien of like video games. Maybe what's the guy who does Death Stranding or whatever? Miyazaki? What's that? Kojima, of course. Might become something close to that. So using you're going to be able to use LLMs to flesh out exquisite virtual worlds. Now, what is that art? I don't know. I think it is, but maybe my colleagues disagree. I think this will be a huge tool for artistic potential. I don't know what it will look like, just in the same way that I think it would have been very hard to predict like Formula One or NASCAR when you get the very first horseless carriages.
Yeah, I think this is going to prompt an exploration of the meaning of the creative act anew, which is going to be a very good thing for us to do. Sort of reestablish, an adequate anthropology. And speaking as a Christian, the creative act is one of the ways we most closely imitate God, right? It's that co-creative act. So I think we're going to see a deeper exploration and desire to understand the connection between a creator and creation, and to be relatively transparent about that connection. So a deeper, I think it's why people don't like AI art. Like, you want to know the person that created the art. So we don't like when sort of agentic power tends to want to hide itself, makes us very uncomfortable. So I think you might see, I don't know, for instance, a really popular musician, composer, or artist who's creating this beautiful art sometime in the next 5 years. The natural question will be, to what extent is that person using AI to create the art? I think people actually want to know that. So there's this whole kind of question about disclosure. I had a very well-known author say he's never going to write another book before because they're basically mostly going to be AI written. Do people deserve to know? Do people care? I think so. So that's one of the things that I'm thinking about deeply as a creator.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. How that we haven't, people don't react well generally to AI art, but I write a lot about the movies, and in the movies we've reached the point where you can AI generate a trailer for an imaginary movie, right? But you're not yet at the point where if I don't like Rings of Power, the terrible Tolkien adaptation on Amazon, I can't go to my my AI assistant and say I want to create the downfall of Numenor as a movie, and give it some parameters and create the downfall of Numenor, right? The movie we all deserve to see. But I will be really interested. My bias is that people will accept artists who do what you're describing, where it's like you have a genius who is performing a creative act in some kind of partnership with the AI, and they will react against the art that seems to be generated without that human connection, and that, like in the case of the movies, people will not want AI-generated movie stars. They will want their movie stars to exist in reality. But am I sure about that? No, I'm not sure about that at all. Like it might be that people are totally comfortable reading who's the Colleen Hoover, right? The sort of feminine romance potboiler novelist. Like if you have an AI that can generate infinite Colleen Hoover novels or infinite Tom Clancy novels. I don't mean to be anyway, you know what I'm saying. Maybe people are just, maybe people accept that. Anyway, that's, so, yes.
So as a scientist, I often find discussions of AI a little bit more pessimistic than perhaps they need to be. I would personally vote myself to be one of the most pessimistic people on the planet, but on this topic, I just would love to hear you comment on the reality of AI. AI can only learn from what currently exists. So if AI had come into existence prior to the modern and postmodern generation of graphic art, before Picasso, before Jackson Pollock, AI could never have created anything even remotely other than representational art, because that's what the art world was. And so it's impossible for AI to extract out of representational art, for example, what Pollock did, or what Picasso did, or what any of the paintings in modern museums are doing that actually appeal to us and expand the horizons of graphic art. So in light of that, I think there's still an awful lot of room for artistic creativity outside of anything that AI could possibly come up with. And yet, once it's there, then AI can probably make infinite variations on the new Jackson Pollock.
But so this is a contested claim, right? But we both of you briefly mentioned your skepticism that we'll get super intelligence, which maybe we can say is distinct from super creativity. But in either case, this is one of the questions hanging over AI is, at the moment, your description is correct, but is there a point at which AI, sort of takes off into a realm where it is sort of learning from itself in some way that transcends what it is already learning from? Where it can generate sort of a new philosophy. We don't have to sort of, use the visual arts, but it can generate true novelty that is indistinguishable from Einstein or Plato or something. And what do you guys think?
I think you've hit on basically the most important and interesting question about AI. I agree with Ross that right now the answer is no, AI can't do those things. And the question is, will that change? I know of a few counterexamples. There's an article that we just published that's talking about the use of AI to try to balance and stabilize fusion field. It's been able to come up with solutions that are significantly more efficient and better at this than humans have been able to. The question about that is it still sort of working within the same paradigm of its training set and just kind of discovered a point within that paradigm that somebody hadn't discovered yet? Or did it find a fundamentally new conceptual field? Feels to me like it's the same conceptual field, but that really is the big open question. And my instinct is to say that there is still enough of a human difference left in creating those kinds of conceptual breakthroughs that AI is not going to be able to do it. And what we're going to be getting is a sameness engine that's going to, by making it so cheap to create more of something that we already have, it's going to destroy the economy that supports the current creators. And basically, you're only going to be able to make money now through radical conceptual innovation, which means it's going to be a really small number of people who are going to do it. But also there's going to be a great hunger for it, because I think everybody's going to sense, and we're already kind of sensing this slowdown in real innovation. Creatively, that is.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah.
I think that one thing that's been sort of lurking around in the background of things that have been said, but needs to be reflected on more, is the ways in which social media and internet technology generally in one way, and artificial intelligence in another way, the more we use it, the less humanly we are acting. So we just are rational animals. We may not like that, but that is what we are. When you interact with people over social media, you're not interacting with them in the same physical space. You can't smell them. You can't touch them. You're not dealing with them in a human way. It's addictive to do this. That's kind of weird. But you're not acting in a human way. If instead of learning to write computer code, I just get an AI to do it for me, then I'm deciding not to use my own intellect as much. And it just seems to me that apart from the question of what will happen to our society if all the other people do that, each of us needs to say, what will happen to me if I decide to do that? And the answer is, I will atrophy. I will atrophy, and there just won't be much left to me. And I just want to go back, that Lord of the Rings has come up twice now. If I remember correctly, when Bilbo says that he feels stretched, what made him feel stretched was his long life together with the ring. And the only good solution for Bilbo was to get rid of the ring and to get it out of his life. And the only real solution for the world for the ring was to destroy it. And so there was no nonsense about, let's negotiate it and find the way to use it. And I just think that's not something we should think about.
Butlerian jihad.
The arc of panel discussions is long, but it bends towards someone referencing the Butlerian jihad. So the Butlerian jihad, for those who don't know, is an imaginary science fiction future in Frank Herbert's Dune novels in which there is a revolution against an anti-computer revolution that creates a new society premised on a commandment that says, thou shalt not make a machine in the likeness of a human mind. And I assume some deplorable percentage of you already knew that, and those who did not now do. So, thoughts?
Well, so a provocation, maybe. A couple years ago, I published this essay in Compact magazine called "Why Conservatism Failed," which is about the conservative movement, conservatism in the West, especially in the United States, is lack of dealing with the problem of technology, the way that it materially rewrites social and economic conditions, and therefore the failure of the whole movement. And I've had a couple of moments in my life where I sort of realized I was not, in the traditional sense, a conservative because of my appreciation of this problem. One of them was, I watched this documentary that Stripe Press made or produced about Stuart Brand, I don't know how to explain Stuart Brand, but countercultural figure. He's sort of like the Forrest Gump of the future. Seriously, he's a kind of follower of Ken Kesey in 1967 in San Francisco. He puts on I think one of the first big Grateful Dead concerts. He runs the AV at the Mother of All Demos when the future of internet technology was demoed in 1969 by Douglas Engelbart. He founds The Well, which is one of the very first internet kind of communities in the late 80s, early 90s. He's just everywhere. Okay, one of his current projects is Pleistocene Park, which is supporting the rewilding of the Siberian tundra, and the capstone of which will be the genetic recovery of the woolly mammoth. This is a project they're actively working on. Now, one of the reasons why they're working on it is because the killing off of the megafauna dramatically altered Siberia to the point where basically it raised temperatures over time, made it malarial. Now there are mosquitoes in Siberia. There were never used to be mosquitoes in Siberia. Okay, so Brandon's talking about this project. And then, they had to be fair, so they bring somebody from, I think, Greenpeace or something, or the Sierra Club, talking about whether we should be really messing with the ecology of Siberia. And I think to myself, there are mosquitoes now in Siberia. Of course we should bring back the woolly mammoth, right? The counterfactual to this claim that you've made is the kind of society we were before the advent of social media and the advent of AI. And I don't think we were on a very good trend as a species or as a culture. If you really go back, I dare you to try and watch a late 90s comedy, particularly one not a Woody Allen comedy, like one that did really well at the box office, right? It is
Whoa.
terrible.
Whoa. I mean, I can take a lot, but casting aspersions on the late 1990s. Anyway, continue.
All that to say, I think, yes, we are facing a challenge to our humanity, but I think it's a bottleneck, and I think it's a bottleneck that when we overcome it, we'll actually come out far better as a species and a culture.
So what you're saying is that it is a gift to the foes of Mordor. Sorry. Yes, at the end. Yep.
Thanks. I want to go back to the question that, or the point that Luke had raised about training, and I'll give you a little example of one of the challenges that comes up of people who have to use these technologies, right? And so in India, I had the director of a seminary told me they're facing a bit of a crisis where it's in a major metropolitan city. All of their seminarians are coming from rural areas. They've never had technology before. In seminary, they have no exposure to cell phones or the internet, and then suddenly they've got a parish. They've got a cell phone, they get addicted to porn, they can't function, right? So I think it's one thing to think about maybe getting rid of these technologies, but a lot of people who have to use them, if you're going to raise them up in an environment where maybe they can be isolated from it, protected from it, at some point they're going to have to learn how to interface with it. And what does that look like? What does a healthy interfacing with this technology look like? Especially when they're both push and pull factors, right? There is an addictive power that some of these things have. There's also the push factors that, your life is going to get miserable from time to time, and it's going to push you towards that, just like, Father O'Malley used to get pushed to the alcohol, right? So what are some practices perhaps you can suggest in terms of living a healthy life and cultivating ways of engaging with these technologies well?
I think the obvious probably just needs to be said that we should focus on actually specific virtues in early childhood development, something that we focus on a lot here at Catholic University. What are the virtues specifically that we need to develop in order to be able to use these technologies well? I'm reminded, Brandon, of a abbot of a monastery that I visited in Italy who said that up until 10 years ago, he rarely saw novices go into the chapel with stacks of books that were piled 10 books high. And he had this theory that they were doing that because they were sort of taking on the way that a computer works, right? That there would be no prayer unless they had input, the books provided the input, and then there would be some kind of output or spiritual revelation or something like that. And he had noticed that shift. And I've never forgot that. It's always sort of scared me, the calculating thought. We're losing the ability to have meditating sort of just openness to wonder. So all of those, I think that there's kind of a John Senior, University of Kansas sort of thing that might need to happen here, where we have an awakening to wonder. We start cultivating these things from an early age. Father Bob, who's sitting in the front row, actually runs a course called the Responsible Use of Technology for Priests, I believe. So we're actively doing that, but I wish that could get scaled down. I don't know how early is too early, but I think waiting until a man is in seminary is probably too late.
I'd like to offer an answer here that runs contrary to my own professional interests, because I run a magazine that publishes criticisms of science and technology. And that answer is that one possible solution is just to think and talk and worry less about technology and focus more on the positive things that we want to be building. So I draw this a little bit from my own personal experience, which is that when I think about my own addictions to technology, like smartphones and social media, adopting practices, whatever, limits this, limits that. I actually bought this thing that's a timer safe, where you can put things that you have addictive problems with in the safe and set a timer, and it doesn't open until the timer is done. So when I get into a real addictive spiral with my phone or something, sometimes I'll put it in there even just for an hour to focus on something. But when those practices are really going well, and when you're cultivating a good and virtuous relationship to technology, you don't need those kinds of artifacts and crutches, because your desire is properly aligned such that you're not jonesing for it. You're not in an addictive spiral. And that makes me think about, we were talking about throwing the ring into Mordor and the Butlerian Jihad. I always circle around in my own thoughts to the Butlerian Jihad because, like I was talking about with John in this essay that we wrote, I think a lot of these problems don't really have solutions as long as we're dealing with the technologies that we have. And the answer is that there are technological paradigms that we're stuck in now that just need to die. And therefore it seems like we need to kill them. But maybe the answer is just to focus on other things such that they die a natural death. I think the most important theoretical set of essays that I've published at the New Atlantis is by an author named Alan Jacobs, who's really terrific. I recommend him. He published a trio of essays that were quietly, he didn't quite say this, but I understood what he was saying. They were essentially a critique of the entire New Atlantis model of my magazine, the tech critique model. And he basically just pointed out, well, this form of tech criticism, the McLuhan thing, the Neil Postman thing, the Jacques Ellul, this species of tech criticism that offers this deep existential, metaphysical, moral critique, it's been around for a long time, decades, 100 years, and it hasn't really succeeded. Kids are even assigned Neil Postman in high school, and yet all of these problems that they're talking about are just getting worse and worse, and why is that? And in his last essay, it's called From Tech Critique to Ways of Living, he offers this image, I think it's drawn from a Chinese poem or a Chinese philosopher or something. It's an image of this village. It's a hypothetic futuristic village. It's a fishing village, and there's a room where they have a computer that has all of the knowledge of all of the world and can connect to anyone else in the world. And the room just sits unoccupied and unused. There's no restrictions on it, but this village and this society is just flourishing to the point that nobody has any particular use for it. So when I try to think about what the real answer to these problems is, my hope is that it would be something like 100 years from now, we look back at the smartphone in the way that we look at those weird claw things and like steampunk inventions from the Victorian era, where it's not like we're opposed to them or are tempted to them like Frodo in the Ring. They just don't even make sense to us. How we get to that point, I don't know, and that's the one thing that is kind of keeping my magazine in business is we're trying to figure that out, along with publishing the standard tech critiques and so forth. But something along that paradigm is what I would like to see the answer be.
All right, it's 8 o'clock, and I know there are more questions, but I think that's a lovely image to end on. So if you want to engage with the panelists further, I'm sure most of them will stay for the reception. And again, I want to thank everyone for coming, and Catholic U and IHE, as always, for hosting. I think this has been a terrific, if sadly necessarily incomplete, conversation. And you know, God knows how many polls have come out in the hour and a half that we've sat here, and I'm not even curious about what they say. So look at that. Look at that. That it just more panel discussions alone, I think, will get us closer to that Chinese village. So please join me in thanking the panelists, and thank you all.